Speaker, this is a very important progress, Madam Speaker, from the NADCO conversations, and a beacon of hope in the country, because every year that we have gone into an election, we have come out more bruised as a nation than before we went to an election. And therefore, it is in order to congratulate the members of the NADCO committee, starting with the co-chairs that, midwifed the production of the documents that then led to inform the pieces of legislation that we're going to see in this house, especially with regards to elections, electoral processes, electoral bodies. And this is one of those, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to start right away by supporting this particular motion, Madam Speaker, because one of the issues that we face as a country is that the commissions that run election are actually above the law, in the sense that the offenses that commissioners do make sometimes are reduced to mere mistakes. However costly they are, Madam Speaker, to the country, they end up not getting held accountable in the eyes of the nation. Madam Speaker, in 2007, I was a very young man in French School Kamusinga, and as a Form 2 then, the chaos that we experienced in our election and the resultant death that we experienced. If you remember, Madam Speaker, there was this envelope that eventually went to in the International Criminal Court. And in that envelope, when eventually the names were revealed in that envelope, Madam Speaker, there were people from the police who were held accountable. And there were politicians who were held accountable. And there were public servants who were held accountable. But there was nobody from the commission then that was the referee that ran the election that were held accountable. Madam Speaker, fast forward 2013, when we had an election that was also contested. Even at appearing at the court, you find that the commissioners always escape scot-free from these problems. And therefore, it's very important that we support this bill. And the bill has attempted to look at those offenses by members and staffers of the commission. And I like the way they are very specific, to the extent that if you look, for instance, the issue of documentation of elections, that is under section 6A, subsection A. And it says that one of those offenses is if anybody makes in any record, return, or other document which they are required to keep or make under such written law an entry which they know or have reasonable cause to believe to be false or do not believe to be true. The documentation of an election, given the fact that this is one of the most radically looked at documentation. For instance, Madam Speaker, we know that forms of election, starting from Form A to Form B to Form C, that then is used to declare elections at a provincial level, and the other ones used at constituency levels, Madam Speaker. These are highly regarded forms that have got security features that are very clear. And Madam Speaker, we have seen a number of instances that those documents are doctored. And electoral officials have got so much power that that doctoring sometimes escapes the mind of the nation because of the bulkness that our elections are. You can imagine, Madam Speaker, that at a presidential level, we are dealing with over 46,000 polling stations. And those polling stations, Madam Speaker, sometimes if these things are not well documented, then we have a problem. And Madam Speaker, I don't want to belabor all the sections and all the offenses that have been listed here, but I wanted to make 3 quick comments. That, Madam Speaker, I think that I will be submitting a number of amendments on this bill, because it is one thing to look at offenses committed during the running of an election. But I think that the biggest offenses that we can face as a country are offenses through the entire process of an election. If you remember 2017 election that was cancelled by or nullified by the court, it was nullified based on the process of the election. And Madam Speaker, in my humble view, this bill seeks to sort 3 things, but it also leaves 3 things that I want to talk about. Number 1, this bill seeks to solve unreasonable delays and unreasonable doctoring of election results. I think that is well captured in this Section 6 amendment. From, if you read all the way from A to M, it is well captured. Number 2, it also seeks to sort the alteration of results. If I were to summarize what I'm seeing from this bill, which is why I'm supporting it. And number 3, it can essentially help us to correct ungazetted polling stations, which sometimes have also featured in a number of our election results, that you end up having some ghost polling stations, like what happened in Migori County, Madam Speaker, in the 2017 election. If you follow that nullification, Madam Speaker, there were variably so a number of polling stations that came to the Supreme Court as ungazetted, non-existent polling stations that then were used to vary that election. To the extent that this bill can solve those 3 issues, it's a big step to the country. However, Madam Speaker, I think that this bill must also explore the entirety of an election process, which I don't think starts by the day of voting. I think that election starts becoming a fraud when we start by registering of voters. And this registration of voters, Madam Speaker, we have seen a number of disenfranchisement of voters. Even now, there are young people in this country, Madam Speaker, who would wish to be registered voters. But because the registration process and the issuance of IDs have been put as separate, Madam Speaker, I think we as a country should choose to believe that it is an offense if you're turning 18 years old and you are going to get your ID and you don't get it with your voter's card. It actually should be an offense. In fact, the issue of voter's card is something that this bill should help us question. If you have got an ID card that is genuine, why do you need a voter's card and you're already 18? And our laws say that at 18 you get an ID card, and at 18 you are a viable voter. Why then must this issue of voter's card be prohibitive for young people to be able to vote? We must be able to explore an amendment that I'll bring into this House on making sure that young people in this country can be able to get their ID cards and either their voter's card on time or use their ID as their voter's card. So that's one thing I'll be exploring, Madam Speaker. Number 2, that I think is important in the registration process, Madam Speaker, is being able to clean our registers on time. I think that commissions at any given time, we must have a duration under which the commissioners must be able to clean the register. And if it is not cleaned the way we have seen a number of elections where a register of an election is not hygiene to conduct an election, so that you don't know which voters are in the register vis-a-vis which voters are actually viable to be able to vote, to the extent that the alteration of results in this country happen because of the issue of voter register, that the commission is being paid to take care of, and if this is something that should happen on a rolling basis. It should not happen that just by the time that we are going to the election is when you see this thing called mass voter registration, where commissioner wants to run around, and sometimes that audit of the voter register is not done properly. So this issue of registration, there are a number of offenses that the commission has done in this country that I'll be pushing amendments. I don't want to go into them in details, but I'll be pushing amendments on the registration of voters that I don't think that has been captured well in the offense that I'm seeing here. The second offense, Madam Speaker, that I think is very important is the role of the commission vis-a-vis the role of the secretariat in terms of looking at procurement as a process. Madam Speaker, if we don't solve the issue of procurement violations on election materials in this country, even if you hold an officer who is sitting on the day of election on some offenses, the election would have been rigged long time ago if there is no hygiene in our procurement processes. And there are a number of those violations, Madam Speaker, that I believe that we must be able to explore, and I'll be pushing those specific amendments on what constitutes offenses of procurement in nature. Because procurement of electoral materials, Madam Speaker, some of them start way before even the year of election starts. There are a number of indices that that have been seen that by the time an election comes in place, Madam Speaker, if you are to reflect on the election that we had in 2017 that was nullified by the Supreme Court, and then you juxtapose that election with the election that will happen in this country in 2022, Madam Speaker, you will find that the filth of those electoral processes happened at procurement, including the laws that our commission ends up signing with vendors abroad is extremely critical to be able to hold them accountable as an offense. For instance, Madam Speaker, if you take a vendor that you have procured from an electoral system, an electronic system that is supposed to deliver an election, and then you are a commissioner plus the secretariat who are the staffers of the commission, and then in that agreement, that contract, you do not protect the country's data such that the institutions that are like what we saw in mathematics, where the institution now has got more rights on the data in the system than Kenyans. Madam Speaker, I think that signing such agreements is tantamount to an offense, because that opens the country to serious procurement problems that then, if not addressed, compromises elections, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, so I will be pushing some serious amendments on procurement processes. And then the last one, Madam Speaker, that I want to talk about today because of pressure of time is the issue of audit of elections. Madam Speaker, is very critical that even as we look at the active element of offenses during the time that election is being carried out, if you look at the act we are trying to amend here, the Election Act offenses of 2016, Madam Speaker, it has seriously negated holding the commission to account on the basis of being able to audit an election. And at what point should that election be audited? I think offenses should be put on every single audit trail so that you'll be able to show the country what the audit of an election should look like at the time of the election, just before results are given out without proper audit, after the results have been announced for all candidates at the local level and national level, and more importantly, after the gazettement of those results. Because if the audit query is not examined as offense, Madam Speaker, then it becomes very difficult to hold individuals who are running our electoral processes to account. So, Madam Speaker, this is a bill that is very good. It's a good start that will help us to look at unreasonable delays in elections. It will be able to help us look at altercation of results. It will be able to help us look at unexecuted polling stations as means of fraud. But I think there are larger questions in our electoral processes, Madam Speaker, that as I support this bill, I will be pushing forward for the amendment of this proposal, and we see whether we can be able to make sure that our elections can have proper measure of integrity through such kind of pieces of legislation. Therefore, I support, Madam Speaker, and I will be able to support further with amendments. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Senator Oketch.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for